Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 5 of Fall into Wonder for National Distance Learning Week. I don't know about all of you, but I know we have had quite the adventure this week, and I hope you have as well. I am here today with my colleagues Donna Farron and Katie Odisi from the New York State Distance Learning Consortium, and we are so happy to welcome all of you for joining us today, and especially Ranger Claire from Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. Before we get started, and I let Claire go ahead and start sharing with us, I just want to remind you that you are able to use that Q&A function that's kind of on the bottom of your Zoom toolbar to answer and ask questions throughout today's program. So Katie, Donna, and I will be taking a look. So if you have some feedback, you want to ask a question, you can go ahead and put it right there anytime today. So without further ado, I am just going to turn this over to Ranger Claire. Ranger Claire, welcome.
Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm Ranger Claire with Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. And to get started, I'm actually going to share my screen with you so that you guys can see my PowerPoint. So just one second. All right. So I am here from Katahdin Woods and Waters, as I mentioned. It is a very snowy and cold place because we are located in Maine. And in fact, we're located really far north in Maine. Maine has 3 National Park Service sites, and we are the third or the most recent one. And we're all the way up at the top, where the other 2 are a little bit further south. So we are here on the homeland of the Wabanaki people, which is a group of indigenous peoples, including the Penobscot Nation, which is one of the groups that we work very closely with here at Katahdin Woods and Waters. So just to give you kind of an overview, this is kind of our park. It is a very large park, and it's directly next to a place called Baxter State Park. What's a little confusing to some people is actually Mount Katahdin, where we get our name from, is in Baxter State Park, not in our park. But we are the woods and the waters that surround Katahdin, the mountain. So here's a view of Katahdin from our park. As I said, it is pretty cold here, so you will see lots of snow. And then this is more recent times of what it looked like, this beautiful fall foliage. So we have some really wonderful and beautiful views here at our park. This is another view, and this one is of our streams because again, woods and waters is our name. So today we are going to actually talk about some of our animals here in Katahdin Woods and Waters and some of their adaptations that have allowed them to live here in our park. So to get started, let's explain first what is an adaptation. A really good way to remember what an adaptation is. So an adaptation is a body part or a behavior that an animal will do to help live and be strong in its environment. So one more time, an adaptation is a body part or a movement that an animal uses to survive and be strong in its environment. So that's kind of what we'll be talking about. And all animals, including us people, have survival needs. So the first question I have for you guys today is I want you to think really hard. If you were suddenly to be in the middle of the woods, what would you need to be able to survive? So, for example, where would you sleep? You don't have your house and you don't have your bed. Where would you sleep? You don't have a kitchen, you don't have a fridge. Where do you get your food? These different adaptations that the animals have help them to meet those survival needs. So today we're going to talk about 4 different types of adaptations, and they're categorized by what they help the animal achieve. So please do these motions with me as we talk about them. So the first type of adaptation we'll be talking about is food. Food. The next adaptation we'll be talking about is water. Water. The third adaptation we'll be talking about is shelter. And the fourth type of adaptation is protection. Protection. All right, let's go through them one more time. So we're going to talk about food, water, shelter, and protection adaptations. So let's get started. As I mentioned, Ka has so many different animals with unique adaptations. Today, we're only going to explore 4 of those animals. And what we'll need to do is we'll need to make a chart so we can keep track of the different animals we talk about. So what I'm going to ask you to do is take this piece of paper that hopefully you have in front of you. If you don't have a paper, I'll give you just a second to go find a piece of paper. But we'll take this plain piece of paper and we're going to fold it in half like a hot dog. You're going to pinch down the side to make a nice crease. Then you're going to take your hot dog bun and you're going to fold it again like this. Again, pinch down that crease for me. Pinch, pinch. Okay, now when you open it up, you should have 4 squares. And we have 4 animals, so that's perfect. So one more time for anyone that doesn't know, you're going to take it, you're going to fold it in half like a hot dog. You're going to fold it in half one more time, and you're going to pinch, pinch along those lines. All right. Now, first animal type that we're going to talk about today is something called a mammal. Mammal. A mammal is an animal that has hair or fur. Do you have hair or fur? That's because people are animals and we are mammals. We have hair and fur. You might have hair on your head. You might have it on your face, maybe on your arms. I bet you even have some nose hair. But that's just normal because we're mammals. So I need you to put on your listening ears for me because we're going to listen to find out what our first mammal is. All right, everyone ready? Does anybody know what kind of animal would make that sound? Do we think it's a small animal or do we think it's a big animal? Probably a big animal, you're right. It's a big sound, so it's probably a big animal. Our first animal we're going to talk about today is the moose. Maine is really famous for moose. We actually have the most moose of any of the lower 48 continuous states. So Maine, not Minnesota, has the most moose. And today we're going to be talking about the eastern moose, which is what you see in the picture here. Now, a moose is the largest member of the deer family, and they typically live anywhere from 15 to 20 years. Now, what's really cool about moose is they're really big, and sometimes it's hard to realize how big they are. So hopefully this picture will help you. A moose just up to its shoulders is usually between 5 to 6.5 feet. So if you look at your teacher standing next to a moose, it might look a little bit like this picture you're seeing. And moose weigh the same as 6 full-size refrigerators, 1,800 pounds. Moose are very, very large animals, and people don't often realize how big they are until they see them. Now, did you know the name moose actually comes from an Algonquin language, and moose, which means stripper or eater of bark, was the origination. So today we call it moose instead of moose, but very similar sound. And mooses will actually have anywhere from 1 to 2 babies each year, known as calves, and they're typically a lighter color than the adults, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So, looking at this animal, what kind of adaptations does it have? Well, we know we're going to talk about 4 types. We're going to talk about food, water, shelter, and protection. So let's think for just a second. What kind of adaptations do we think a moose has to help protect it in its environment? All right. So if you guys want to look at me, I have in my hand a moose skull. I'll step back so you can see it. Do you see how big this skull is compared to my head? It's a big animal. So moose have lots and lots of different types of adaptations, but we're first going to talk about their teeth. Their teeth. So if you can see the shape of their teeth, they have a flat tooth. That means that this animal is a herbivore or a plant eater. They have some sharp incisors toward the front right there that help them to cut off tough vegetation, but then they chew it up with their flat plates here in the back. So moose have lots of really cool teeth, and including, in fact, not a tooth. In the front here, you'll notice that there's less teeth than on the bottom. That's because they actually have a plate, a cartilage plate right here that acts like a knife on a cutting board. So the bottom teeth are the knife and that plate on the top is the cutting board, and it helps to cut off that vegetation so that they can chew them really well. This is important because moose like to eat leaves, buds, twigs, bark, all of these kind of harder plants, and then that will help them chew it up really well. And a full-grown moose can eat 70 pounds of food in one day. That's a lot of food, so they have to have really good teeth. Another cool thing about the moose is on their face, you'll see this big nose. They got this big nose. This nose is really sensitive and it helps them to push through all the different layers of vegetation to find exactly what they want. And so it actually moves a lot. And then the last cool thing about their face is they've got this really sensitive lip, and the lip will help them figure out which one is a fresh shoot, a little bit softer to chew, and which is a harder twig, which is a little more difficult. And so all parts of their face work together to help them eat with their food adaptations. Next up, we can talk about water adaptations. Water. So moose actually are very good swimmers. You might not think that because they're these big animals, but they swim really well. In fact, a moose can swim 6 miles in 1 hour. Most people swim about 2 miles an hour, so they're very fast in the water. Now, what kind of water adaptations do you think a moose has? Well, they will be able to forage for aquatic plants both under and above or on top of the water. Moose may dive and stay under the water for 50 seconds. So, what we're going to do is we're going to hold our breaths for 10 seconds to kind of see what that's like. So, do me a favor, take a deep breath and then hold it. Oh, oh my goodness, that was a long time. And a moose can do that 5 more times without taking a breath. That's really impressive. So, one fun thing about the moose that also works is their fur. Looking at this picture, do you see how some of the fur looks wet and some of it looks dry? That's because there's actually two layers to their fur. The first layer is a long guard hair, and the underlayer is a soft woolly undercoat. The underlayer is to keep them nice and warm, but the guard hairs are hollow, and this actually helps them stay afloat when they're swimming, which is why they're partially such good swimmers. They're so good at swimming and they like water so much that some people will call moose a rubber-nosed swamp donkey, which is kind of a funny name. Next up, we're going to talk a little bit about, oops, one of the last things I wanted to mention was their feet. If you notice on their feet, they have these big feet. That's because moose live in the woods and the water, so they are sheltered. Their shelter is both woods and water, and they need to be prepared for both. And the way they do that is using these big feet that they have on the bottom. And the feet will help them walk on top of snow, just like snowshoe, and will help them paddle in the water, just like flippers. So they have very cool feet, even though they're really big. So far we've talked about their food, their water, their shelter. The last thing we want to talk about the moose is their protection. What's something that they can do to protect themselves? Moose have really powerful and long legs. An adult moose can run 35 miles an hour. The average person only runs 8 miles an hour. So the moose can definitely outrun a person. You won't be able to run away, but they won't chase you typically. This is for them to be able to run away from their predators. The calves grow very, very fast. In just 5 days after they're born, they're able to outrun humans already. Again, this is a survival adaptation to help them get away from predators that might be chasing them. Another cool thing about their legs is moose can kick in any direction. They don't have to worry about where the predator is because they can kick out any direction with their hooves, which is not very normal. Humans, like us, our legs can do the same thing because we have this cool ball shape in our hips that help us move around. Moose have that too, but not all animals have that ability, so it's really cool. The final protection adaptation we're going to talk about is the antler. Now, male moose or bulls use antlers to fight, to protect their families, but also to compete for a mate. These are big and very, very strong, and they grow them every year. Because they're so big and so strong, when you're walking through a forest with this big thing on your head, you're probably going to get stuck into a lot of trees. So they do need this for protection and to find a mate, but then after mating season, they just shed them. And you'll find them just anywhere in the woods, just on the ground. And they'll grow a whole new big set by the next year. So that is very cool. Now, unfortunately, female moose do not have antlers. However, because of their really awesome kicking strength and their running, they're able to protect themselves as well. So now we've talked about different adaptations of the moose, including their food, their water, their shelter, and their protection. And what I want you to do is I want you to take that chart in front of you, so your four-piece chart, and you're going to pick one of the boxes. And I want you to draw your favorite adaptation of the moose. So, some reminders of what we talked about. We talked about mooses are able to use their very special teeth, their very big size, their antlers, their long legs, their big hooves, their fur, and so many other things. We don't have time to draw all those things, so let's pick one thing that we like. I personally really like their feet. So I'm going to draw a big, big hoof, just like that. Whoops, there it goes. Now, the important thing about this drawing, it doesn't have to be perfect. You just have to know what it looks like. And as you can see, Ranger Claire is not very artistic, but that's okay, because I know what it is. So I'll give you a little bit of time to pick out your favorite thing before we move on to our second mammal.
Ranger Claire, while people are drawing, I had a couple questions come in.
Of
One
course,
question was about the moose with its when it was, I think it was from when it was eating in the water. And the question is, do they reach down with their neck or do they dive down into the water to get the food?
that's a really good question. And the answer is both. They have these long necks so they can grab the kind of shorter stuff, but moose can actually dive anywhere from 12 to 20 feet underwater. That's where those big, deep breaths can come in handy because they can hold their breath, go super far down, grab the plant, and come back up.
Wow, that's fascinating. And then we had a question come in about the baby, right? And
Okay.
the question is, does the moms ever outrun the babies and the babies get lost?
That's a really good question. And the answer is no. Even though the mom moose could outrun the baby, they're not going to leave their babies behind. In fact, mooses, if they're ever scared, they'll get their baby to start running and they'll stand in between whatever is scaring them and the baby. They don't want to run until they have to, and then they will run behind their baby moose. Any other questions?
Great. Those were the ones that I saw. So I think we're
Awesome.
good.
All right. Let's
I
get
know I
started.
picked the water adaptation for my
Ooh,
drawing.
that's a good choice. They've got some
That,
really cool ones.
that's what
So
I
next
picked too.
Did you?
Yeah.
Next, we're going to talk about another mammal. Remember, mammals are animals that have hair or fur. And we're going to talk about the Canada lynx. Now, the Canada lynx is a really, really cool animal. But first, I want to ask if you can raise your hand if you have a cat or somebody you know has a cat in their house. Raise your hand. Yeah, lots of cats. That's great. Did you know that the Canada lynx is 2 times as big as a house cat? So try to picture a cat and then double it. So they're pretty big, but they're not really, really big animals. They're kind of smaller, and that's actually very helpful for them. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But first, let's mention that they are carnivores. So previously, the moose was a herbivore or plant eater. Canada lynx are carnivore, which means that they eat meat. Again, they're about twice the size of a house cat, so their animals that they're eating are usually smaller, like hares, rabbits, mice, other things like that. But they can eat other animals if the opportunity comes. They have this really pretty color fur, which will help them. Now, one thing that's really interesting is a lynx is very similar looking to something called a bobcat. So, some people know what a bobcat is, but what the main difference is, if you ever see an animal and you're like, I'm not sure if it's a bobcat or a lynx, you have to look at their paws. So, looking at their paws, this is a Canada lynx paw. When it's held against a human hand, it maybe doesn't look that big. Definitely bigger than a house cat, but maybe not that big. But if you look at this, a Canada lynx paw versus a bobcat paw, it's very different. So, everyone, put your hands out in front of you, and I want you to take one hand and stretch it as far as you can, and take the other hand and turn it into a ball. That's the size difference between a lynx and a bobcat's paw. So even though their bodies are similar size, their paws are very different sizes. So let's talk a little bit about food. food adaptations with the Canada lynx. Canada lynx have very, very large feet, as we talked about, and long hind legs. And this makes them really, really good at hunting, especially in the snow. And that's great because their favorite food is a snowshoe hare, this little guy right here. And snowshoe hares, obviously, they like the snow. And so having those big feet walking on the snow helps them to be able to catch up to their prey as well. Now, this is different than most wild cats like cougars or bobcats because they'll actually sink into the snow. Their smaller feet will go into the snow, but the lynx stays on top of the snow. Another really cool adaptation that helps them get their food is actually their coat. A coat, how does that help them get food? Well, because lynx are actually not very fast animals, and snowshoe hares are very fast. So if that's their favorite thing to eat, a lot of times the lynx will have to sit in the cold and wait until the snowshoe hare is really close by. And so they're able to stay warm and not get cold while they're waiting for their food. So that's a pretty cool adaptation. Another one that helps them with their food is their teeth. So this right here is a Canada lynx skull. So they have very different teeth than the moose. As you can see, they're a lot sharper. And this is really cool because these long forefront teeth that they have, their canines, will actually grab onto the animal that they're trying to grab, and they're able to hold on to it. So remember, the snowshoe hare is very fast, and the Canada lynx not so fast. So they need to grab onto it and make sure that they don't lose their hair or their meal. And so that's pretty cool use of their teeth. Another really cool thing about these teeth is that they are actually very sensitive. So what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to take your finger and I'm going to have you very gently tap, tap, tap on your teeth. Gently tap, tap, tap. You can feel a little bit of pressure, maybe a little bit of motion. The Canada lynx can feel a lot more than us. And so when they are coming to bite down and the snowshoe hare is running, they can feel in their teeth if they have the hair and they'll close their jaw. If they don't feel that they have it, they'll keep their mouth open so that they get another chance to try to grab onto that hair. So their sensitive teeth also helps them get some good food. Their final adaptation that helps them with food, because typically carnivores, a lot of their adaptations are about food. They have these cool little tufts on the top of their ears that are black. And these long, tall tufts will actually help them hear sounds super far away. And this is really important because in snowy woods, even the smallest sound can be kind of hard to understand because snow muffles sound. And so they have to be able to hear even the smallest sound. Again, because they can't outrun the hare, they have to wait till it comes to them. They have to be able to hear the sound and know where the sound is going, and those tufts help them do that. So Canada lynx has lots of very cool food adaptations. Let's talk a little bit about their water adaptations. Now, most cats don't like water, right? Canada lynx, they don't love water, but they can actually swim very, very well. And that's important because they're able to get across areas, like our park has woods and waters because we have many different rivers, and they're able to cross those areas to get to different hunting grounds. Now, one very cool thing about cats, all cats, but including the lynx, is actually their tongue has these tiny little hooks on them, like that. So if you've ever been licked by a cat and it feels kind of rough, that's why. Now, Canada lynx hooks are a little bit more pronounced, and what it does is it helps to scoop up water while they're drinking and keep it in their mouth. Have you ever tried to take a drink and the water spills down your front and you're wet? Ugh, that's not a very fun feeling. Now, Canada lynx live in very cold areas, so if they get wet, that makes them even colder. So those hooks help keep that water in their mouth so they don't get as cold. It's a pretty cool adaptation for a cat that doesn't typically like water. So now let's talk about shelter. Everyone do your shelter hands for me. Awesome, thank you. So lynx live in dense forests or areas with lots of underbrush or little plants that kind of cover the ground. And you're going to find snowshoe hare there, which is their favorite food. So it makes sense. But did you know that lynx do not build dens? In fact, instead, what they do when they're having their kittens is they will find a natural feature such as a fallen log, a root system, a ground hole with some coverage on it, and that's where they will have their different little kittens. And this behavior of choosing shelter, remember, adaptations are both body parts and behaviors, So behavior of choosing a shelter that already exists can actually help to protect them from their young because they don't have to protect the young from their predators. They don't have to worry about building a den and spend all that energy. They just find a good place, they have their kittens, and they go back to protecting their kittens. So that's how they use their shelter adaptation. And the final adaptation for the lynx is their protection. Protection. So we mentioned the fur earlier, and the fur is very, very helpful for their food adaptations, but also for their protection adaptations. So their fur is generally shorter in the summer because it's a little warmer in the summer. But in the winter, the hair grows longer and thicker, and it gives them kind of a warmer coat, but also helps them to kind of blend into their backgrounds even better. Because obviously, when there's snow on the ground, you might want to be white, but there's lots of areas in the woods that aren't white, like this tree right here. This is in the middle of winter, but it's got this pretty color, and that helps the lynx blend in. So that helps to protect them from anything trying to find them. Another thing that they can use for protection are their paws, or their specifically claws. So your paws or your claws. So their claws are sharp, sharp, sharp. And this helps to protect them if they're ever fighting, if they're trying to get food, different things like that. But what's really cool is they can actually retract their claws, which means to put them away so that they're not out. This is really important because if their claws are out all the time, they'll be scraping against the ground. Scrape, scrape, scrape. And that'll make them dull and they won't be very strong or protective. So they fully retract their claws to help protect them. All right, it's time for our chart again. Our lovely little chart. Pick the next box, whichever box you want, and pick out your favorite adaptation of the lynx. So again, remember, they've got cool things. They've got their very special teeth, their retractable claws, their winter fur, their really big paws, their great hearing, and so many more. So pick out your favorite, and I'll give you a little time to draw it.
I had a question for you, Ranger Claire.
Yeah.
Earlier this week, we one of the parks we visited, they showed a mountain lion, and they said the mountain lion only mostly comes out at night. Does the lynx come out during the day or during the night or both?
That's a great question. Lynx are typically out more towards the dawn and the dusk. So I think you mentioned another park already talked about this word, which is crepuscular. It's towards the dawn and the dusk area, or diurnal is another word for it. They do come out at night sometimes, and they do come out at days sometimes, but typically more dawn and dusk. All right,
So
any
I
other
know
questions?
it's
Thank you.
not the same, but I saw a question come in about um, the ears of the lynx. We had
Uh-huh.
compared their paws to the bobcat. Do the bobcats have those same kinds of tufts? I know we're talking about the lynx, but we have some students curious about that for the
No,
bobcat's hearing too.
yeah, that's a great question. Actually, bobcats don't have the tufts. They have different types and different shapes of ears. So that's another good way to tell the difference. If you can't see the animal's paw, you can look for the tufts. Now, the tufts, because they're black, they do tend to blend into the environment. So sometimes it's hard to see. But bobcats will not have them and lynx will.
Do
All right.
both cats live in your area?
Ooh, that's a good question. So, bobcats are much, much larger population and they live in a lot more different areas. Canada lynx usually live further north, so very northern edge of the US and Canada, which is why they got their name. And there are some areas that they overlap. In our park, we actually haven't confirmed that we've seen any bobcats, but we have seen lynx. So right now we're not fully sure. However, most likely they do, but both of the animals are very sneaky. They're cats, right? So they can be stealthy. So I can't say that we don't have them, but we definitely know we have lynx.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we talked a little bit, but I do want to take a quick second and do a wiggle break. So if you're sitting down, could you please stand up with me? And what we're going to do is we're just going to shake our body out. Shake our body out. I know we're sitting for a while, so sometimes we need to shake and shake. All right. And when you feel ready, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're going to have a seat. Good wiggle break, everyone. All right. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is not a mammal. How do we know it's not a mammal? It doesn't have hair and it doesn't have fur. So what kind of animal is it? Well, we're going to talk about fish. Now, fish are very, very cool animals because they have vertebrae or they have spines just like us. But instead, not like us, they live in the water the full time and they get their oxygen from water. So, everyone, you take your hands with me, put them up against your face like this. Do this. You're going to suck in your lips like this and make the best fish face you can. So, what are we doing with our hands right here? Does anybody know? These little guys are representing gills. Gills are how fish get oxygen from the water. And so those little movements are actually them pulling in oxygen. All right, so let's get talking about the Atlantic salmon, which is one of Katahdin Woods and Water's favorite fishes. So this little fish right here is called the king of fish. His species name is salar, which means leaper. These fish can swim very, very fast and they can jump really high. They can jump 12 feet into the sky. If you look up right now, most likely your ceiling is not even 12 feet. Usually it's about 9 or 10 feet. They can jump even higher than that, and they're little fish. It's pretty cool. Now, even though they are born in fresh water, they are migratory fish. Migratory means that you are born one area, you go to a different area, and you come back. So they'll be born usually in the rivers of Maine, and they'll swim out to the ocean as they grow up, and they'll swim all around the ocean, and then they'll come back up the rivers when they're ready to lay their eggs. So salmon will move through a long, long journey to be able to live their lives. Let's talk a little bit about salmon's life cycle. So they have lots of different life cycles. When they're first born, they're little tiny eggs. And here's an example. You can see there's a couple small rocks and little tiny dots of orange. Those are the eggs. Then they will pop out and they'll be alevin, which are kind of small, have these kind of little silly looking bellies on them. Then they'll turn into fry fish, which look like this. Then they'll turn into parfish, which look like this. And then they'll turn into smolt fish, which look like this. And then they'll turn into the full-size salmon. But why does that matter? Well, because where they are in life, where they're living, is dependent on what size they are. So as you can see on our picture, they're eggs, they're alevin, they're fry, they're par. They're over on the left side where it says freshwater. So they're living in streams and rivers. But once they get to the smolt stage and the adult stage, they're actually out in the ocean water or salt water. So this little guy here is a smolt. And even though he's little, he's a very brave fish because he's the one that's going to swim from the river into the ocean. Now, before they swim away from their rivers, they're little fish. And so that means that their food adaptation needs to be for small animals. So on the top, you'll see two pictures. You'll see a black fly and you'll see some tadpoles. These little tiny things are what the small salmon will eat. Then, as they go out to the ocean and they become big fish, they'll switch their diet and they'll eat fish such as this bottom picture, which is called a capelin fish, Atlantic herring, sand lance, and lots of other fish that are much bigger, but still not as big as the salmon is. So part of their diet is actually part of their adaptations for food. They eat small animals when they're in small rivers and they are small, and they eat bigger animals when they're in the big ocean and they are bigger. So that is a food adaptation, their change of their diet. Next up, we're going to talk a little bit about their water adaptation. Their water adaptation. Now, salmon are really special fish because they're what's called andromynous. And andromynous lives in water and salt water, fresh water and salt water. Most fish can only live in one. So if you get a fish out of the river, most of the time it can only live in the river. And if you get a fish out of the ocean, most of the time it can only live in the ocean. But salmon can do both. Now, this is a really cool adaptation because it gives them lots of opportunities. For example, if they're living in the river, they can lay their eggs in somewhere small, safe, and shallower. And then when they get bigger and they want bigger food, they can go out to the ocean. So they can switch back and forth, which is not very common for fish, but Atlantic salmon can do that. It's a very cool water adaptation. Their next one is going to be their shelter adaptation. Shelter. So salmon need deep oxygenated pools to be able to lay their eggs safely. And remember how teeny tiny those eggs are. And so what you're seeing here is actually the river bottoms where they would lay their eggs. See all those rocks at the bottom of the ocean? That's where they're going to lay their eggs. Excuse me. Another really cool thing is that when they're little tiny fish, they use those rocks that they were laid on as protection. So when they're little bitty, they'll come out and they'll eat some insects and then they'll go back under to protect themselves from any of the bigger fish. And then as they grow bigger and bigger, they'll again move down to different types of shelter that they might need at their current size. Now, the final protection or adaptation we're going to talk about, adaptations, are their protections. Protections. So salmon will turn lots of different colors during their life. When they're smaller fish, they'll start to turn silvery because they're moving towards the ocean, which has more of a silver color. And when they're bigger fish and they're moving back up the river to lay their eggs, they'll turn more of this brown color, to make it easier to kind of adapt and to be blended into the colors of their water, which will help protect them. Now, salmon don't have a lot of natural strengths to be able to protect themselves, so the color is a very important one, but another very, very important one is laying a lot of eggs. So a single female salmon can lay 7,000 eggs. Now, this is really important because most of these eggs, unfortunately, will not survive to adulthood. In fact, only about 15% will even survive to the fry and smolt stage. 15%. So that means if you look around in your classroom and let's say there's 20 of you, only about 2 or 3 of you are going to survive. That's a lot of fish that get lost. And so they have to lay these big number of eggs to make sure that they're safe. Now, unfortunately, for the salmon, because of human activities such as logging, building bridges and dams, their journey back up the river is more difficult than it needs to be. Different things like this, which is called a culvert. A culvert is really important to people because it helps us prevent flooding on roads. But this kind of culvert that you can see in the picture makes it really hard for the salmon to swim back upriver. Thankfully, after a while, unfortunately, their population started going down and people started to notice. And so we have been starting to change some different things in our area to try to help them move. So for example, we build bridges that look like this. You can still see the river is nice and straight. The fish are able to go up the river, but the people can still cross a bridge and it won't get flooded. So having these different kind of things is helping to protect the salmon because they don't have a lot of natural protections themselves. All right, so that's our salmon. Go back to our lovely chart. We're going to pick box number 3. Box number 3. I am going to pick one of my favorite adaptations, which is the fact that they can change colors. But definitely pick one that you like. For example, changing their food, changing from fresh water to salt water, laying lots of eggs, hiding under rocks. Any of those different things works out great. So take a moment to draw your fish adaptation. All right, let's move on to our final type of animal. So far today, we have talked about mammals like our moose and our lynx because they have hair. We know they're mammals. And then we talked about our fish who does not have hair, but he's got some gills that help him survive in the water. Our final animal that we'll talk about today is an amphibian. Amphibians. Amphibians are a type of animal that are cold-blooded. They need to be warmed by the sun. They breathe through their skin. They are carnivores. They eat meat like the lynx, and they spend time in water and out of water. So kind of like how the Atlantic salmon is a special fish because it can be in rivers and the ocean, this amphibians are very special because they can be in the water and on the land. And today we're going to focus on Katahdin Woods and Water's red-backed salmon. But if you look at this picture, you're thinking, Ranger Claire, that's not a red salmon. What are you talking about? Well, that's because one of the adaptations that our salamander, our redback salamander has is color change. Now, sometimes they'll be black-backed or lead-backed, and sometimes they'll be red-backed. And these different colors are a signal for predators, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And another important thing to remember about salamanders is they're small. They're only about 2 inches to 5 inches, so they're much smaller than most of the animals we've talked about today. But they still have to eat, so let's find out some of their food adaptations. Number one, they can eat a wide variety of different animals. They can eat worms and snails and insects and larvae. And they do this using their tongue. So they shoot their tongue out and it grabs what they're trying to get and it takes it back into their mouth. And I even have a video to show this because salamanders actually can still do this tongue thing even in hot weather or cold weather. So let's just check that out real quick. Let's see what they do. So this is a slow down version, but you see their tongue shoot out and they're able to grab their food and to bring it back in. Now, the video on the bottom is the warm weather, and see how fast that happened? The video on top is the cold weather. He's still able to grab his food, but it's just a little slower, and that's okay. But their tongues are very cool. All right, let's go back over here. So they've got these really cool tongues, and they also have the stickiness that helps them grab it, and that is their food adaptation. Next, we're going to talk about their water adaptation, their water. Now, we talked a little bit earlier that amphibians can live in water or they can live on land, and so that means they have to have this very special way of breathing. So they don't actually have any lungs. We have lungs. So do me a favor, put your hands on your chest like this. You're going to take a big deep breath on 3. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Now push it out. If you felt your chest go up and down, that's because of your lungs. However, they don't do that. They breathe through their skin. And so what they have to do is they have to use something called a coastal groove. Now, do me a favor and put your hand out like this, flat, and 2 fingers together. You're going to take your other pointer finger and you're going to go around the edge of that. Nice and easy and kind of short, right? Now, open your fingers up like this and do it again. Oh no, now you have to go so much further. And that's what coastal grooves do. And it makes the air and the water go across the body for a lot longer to give the skin time to absorb that oxygen. Very cool adaptation that lets them live both in water and out of water. Now, the redback salamander, I keep trying to say salmon, salamander, he does not actually live in water full time, but he needs to be wet and moist. And so he will most likely be found on land, but you'll always find him in a damp area. All right, next one, let's talk about their shelter. Shelter. So they are often found underneath logs, litter, leaves. Leaf litter is what I meant to say there. Burrows, different areas like that. They live in these areas because they're very small. They're able to hide under them from any predators. They also, when it's cold, will burrow down under the ground. So you can find salamander under the ground, but it's typically only when it's very cold outside. The females will lay their eggs in very dark and damp environments, including in log crevices and under rocks, to help protect them from predators like frogs. Frogs really like to eat their eggs, so they want to try to hide it from the frogs. So those are their 2 different shelter adaptations. And the final adaptation of the salamander is their protection. All right, so we talked about the 2 colors. One, they're red, one, they're black. This is a type of protection. Why? Well, because when they're black or gray, then faced with a threat, they can hide sneakier. It's dark, just like the areas they like to be in, so it's dark. When they're out in the open and they see a predator, they'll turn bright red. This is to show that the predator, that you don't want to eat him. He is going to be a poisonous food, so they don't want to eat him. And the final thing that's really cool the salamander can do is a salamander can drop his tail off, just like that. It'll just fall off and he can run away. This is important because if a predator grabs his tail, he can just drop it off and run away and he will survive and it won't hurt him. So those are very cool protection adaptations for our salamander. All right, last box. We're going to pick out one of our favorite adaptations. So for example, it could be the color, it could be the skin grooves, the coastal grooves, it could be its tongue, its tail falling off. so many more cool things.
Ranger Claire, we just had a couple questions here.
Absolutely.
One question is about the tongue.
Okay.
It looked like there was a, I'll ask the question what it is there a
Yes.
hand at the end of the tongue?
That's a good question. Actually, what it is, it's very cool. It's part of their jaw and it'll go out and it kind of does act like a hand where it helps to scoop, but it's not an actual hand.
And then there's a question about can they get stepped on? Can salamanders get stepped on by people?
Unfortunately, yes. But I will say salamander are very fast. So if they see you coming, they're going to scurry away so that they don't get stepped on. Any other questions?
I saw one about how long is that tongue? It looked as long as the salamander.
That's a good question. I don't know the exact length, but they can shoot it out very far, as you saw in the video. So I would guess at least 2 or 3 inches, which for an animal that's only 2 to 5 inches, that's pretty strong or pretty long. All right. Well, thank you guys for exploring Katahdin Woods and Water's animal adaptations with me today. I hope you enjoyed learning about our moose, our Canada lynx, our salmon, our salamanders. Don't forget that animals need different types of adaptations to help them survive in all their different environments. Typically, they have 4 types of adaptations, ones that help with food, ones that help with water, ones that help with shelter, and ones that help with protection. So if you have any further questions, I'll be here for a little while to answer them. Otherwise, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, go if
Thank
you have
you
any
so
questions, pop them
much.
into the Q&A. But Ranger Claire, thank you so much for telling us all about these amazing adaptations of these animals. And I just want to take a moment to thank Ranger Claire and all our national parks and our teachers and students that participated with us. We really had a fun time. Have a great day.